there isn't a push to fix the bias within accessibility to income and education and what have you on the ground level. We have
So now Vaush is doing what Hasan was doing, where now he's not really talking about meritocracy anymore. He's talking about the economic system that would empower people to engage or better engage in said meritocracy. Not too long ago, I made a video about meritocracy, critiquing a fellow content creator. Second thought, because he believed that America was not a meritocracy. I disagreed with this. And I disagreed with him, I think, on some pretty good grounds. Primarily that although America isn't 100% a meritocracy, I would argue no society ever would be a meritocracy, because to achieve 100% meritocracy would be insane. You'd have to do some insane stuff to get everyone on board at that and to make sure that was implemented correctly, because you probably just have to arrest a lot of people. It would just be really hard to judge. So here's the thing. I think viewing a meritocracy is really hard to do. And our good buddies, our old pals, Hasan, Abi, and Vaush, they had some takes. This isn't even super recent, but it's been something that's kind of just been on my mind for a while. And I decided I wanted to just go over it now. So let's do that. So first up, Hasan discussing meritocracy with Christian Walker. And then next we'll do Vaush discussing meritocracy with Taptash. So first up, Hasan.
Do you think the United States is a meritocracy where people with merit actually succeed? Really?
I don't think it's...
Do you think the United States is a meritocracy where people with merit actually succeed?
A lot of the time, yeah.
Really?
I don't think it's universal, no, but for a lot of people, yes, absolutely.
I don't agree with that at all.
I mean, you don't think it's possible to work your way up with merit, literally. This is anecdotal, but like, it's just not true. So that's so many people's stories. So,
I mean, no, it definitely happens. It happens less than in places that have less.
So I'll just start here, because they're kind of already getting off track. So the big distinction I think a lot of people misunderstand when it comes to meritocracy is a meritocracy is really just a system in which you select and promote people based on merit. And so a lot of people think the easiest thing to go to, a lot of people go to, is, getting a job. Is the most meritocratic person getting a job. But it also goes from consumer to supplier of something, right? Like if you go to the doctor, you probably want to go to the best doctor. If you want to get a plumber, you probably want to get the best plumber. So on and so forth in that kind of way. Where we're judging, we're not even really judging. We're usually having someone tell us what's the best, and then we're kind of going off what they say and choosing based off what other people say, because, we're obviously gonna have a hard time evaluating what doctor is a good doctor or what doctor is a bad doctor. So that's a meritocracy. Social mobility doesn't really have anything to do with a meritocracy, but arguably it's sort of a tangential metric, where I think most people would agree that a healthy meritocracy is one in which there is a high degree of social mobility. But I'm not going to spoil the whole thing. Let's get through what Hasan has to say and Christian Walker has to say, and then we'll do Vaush and Taptash. I'm going to give a little dialogue here and there, and after we watch those two, to kind of, I'm going to do my best to summarize their belief, and I understand what their belief is, and then I'm kind of going to go in and address the issues that they're seeing and how they kind of don't really link up with their idea of meritocracy and their critiques of meritocracy.
Less of a fuck you, pay me thing than we do. Like, not like No one's gonna call like any of these like EU nations socialist by any meaningful definition, but people are less on their own there, and they have more social mobility. More people move up than they do here.
Yeah.
In the last 30 years.
Like, I wouldn't be in the situation that I'm in if I didn't have a good spawn point. Okay, my family relatively affluent in Turkey, right? And despite the fact that my dad lost everything by the time I went to college, it doesn't matter because the affluent beginning that I got in the form of a great education and all this other stuff, not being burdened with like debt or having to work or anything like that, and being able to focus on myself and my education, gave me the opportunities that
Absolutely.
that I
Same
have
for
now.
me.
But that's not so social safety nets would make up for that.
Well, both my parents grew up extremely poor.
So I think it's important. I think it's important that I distinguish this early on. Really, what they're talking about is the economic system. That doesn't really have anything to do with a meritocracy, because you kind of have to think. Even though the system that selects and promotes is usually heavily based on which economic system is implemented. For example, aristocracy was highly linked and highly correlated with a feudal system, where you have your peasants, your serfs, and they really have no mobility in society whatsoever. They're going to be born a serf, they're going to die a serf. And the aristocracy, they have a much more social attitude, social mobility in terms of their career and positions they can fill in their society that the serfs do not. A meritocracy is really just about how you are selecting people to advance, regardless of their background. We don't care about that. It's just kind of someone steps into the interview room and you evaluate them. You know, ideally, this doesn't really happen because usually you do some work ahead of time evaluating the person, such as, looking up on LinkedIn, analyzing their resume, maybe having them take a technical test or whatever, and you evaluate them that way. You're usually not looking at someone, or you shouldn't be in a meritocracy. You're not looking into, who their father is, who their mom is. You're just trying to evaluate their merits regardless of everything else.
Or work their way up. So it's just like we can
like,
play this game of stories, but
like one of your parents had like
my parents zero. My dad
I know,
fat.
But what I'm saying is like he had he's
athletic
like
ability.
Well,
some people have
not
IQ ability.
Not just like athletic ability, but like one of the most amazing athletic abilities of all time.
And
that probably we'll ever see.
And my stepdad had no athletic ability. I think he's probably has a really high IQ. Sure, built a business.
And athletics is a really good example of a meritocracy, because you don't, or you shouldn't at least, for the most part, people are selected to be on a team or to be in a position because they're good, especially in professional sports. Otherwise, you're going to be replaced and removed astonishingly quickly.
Has much more money than my father. Maybe I do not want to all end up at the same place. I want people who have a special skill to get rewarded for that skill, whether that's a brain skill, whether that's an athletic skill. That's what I want.
But do you think that like the children of a guy who has no skills, who just every day's a gamble for him and he always loses, do you think they deserve to like live in misery, like to live without dignity?
No,
to like worry about where they're gonna live. No,
but there's so many kids with parents who have special skills, and those parents blow their special skill off, and that's on the parent.
But like, what about? What about the kid though? Like, is the kid just fucked then?
No, but what do you propose?
Do you think
that there's government housing?
We have government housing.
No, we don't.
We want better government housing.
No, we don't have government housing.
Okay, and so I would argue, I would say really, they're not really talking about meritocracy anymore. Beyond this point, they're really just talking about the economic system and the social safety nets, which doesn't have anything to do with a meritocracy. And so I think this is a good intro, because I think this is how a lot of people view it. But to kind of reinforce this idea, let's watch Vaush and Taftaj.
In our current society, if like a janitor is able to, have great managerial skill, companies have a lot of incentive to discover that and to promote that person up.
How
I don't
would
think
they
that
know?
happens. Yeah, I don't think that happens very often because companies have decided that like the chance of a janitor having significant managerial skill is low enough that they don't want to like actively seek that out. So they're waiting for the janitor to demonstrate that in some way, either by going and getting education or proving through some other means that they have that skill. So I think they're doing that calculus, but they are doing the calculus because ideally they do want to make as much money as possible.
You play.
So Taftaj's argument here is it's the very classic rational economic actor that they're evaluating everything wholly rationally. They're trying to take in as much information as possible and make the best decisions possible off the information they were given. And I would say most people would agree that that's kind of a fantasy. That, as humans, we can only take in so much information, and we have recency bias, we're biased in other ways. So we have a really hard time evaluating everything we've seen, everyone we know, and all the work every person has done.
Place way too much stock in the effectiveness of these incentives. If these incentives were relevant, we wouldn't have massive biases in who receives how much pay or who gets to the top of any given field or industry. The people who make these hiring decisions are not brain geniuses. They're quaalude, choking, cocaine snorting pedophiles. They are not looking over the janitor and thinking, how can we psychiatrically analyze this person to make sure they have the managerial skills necessary? This just doesn't happen.
And so this is a really good point that Vaush is bringing up, especially in terms of managerial skill. It's really hard to evaluate someone's merit in that capacity. Evaluating someone's merit in a workplace like that, in which you're a person who's dealing with other people, that's really, really hard to evaluate. And most of the time, what people are looking for is previous experience, because that's the best way we could measure. Like, if you were a manager previously, there's a good chance if I'm a hiring manager or a recruiter or whatever, and I want to fill a managerial position, I'm probably going to be looking for people who have managed previously, because that'll be a much better one-to-one comparison at which I can judge their performance in that previous position as a manager to draw a conclusion if whether they'll be a good fit for this new managerial position. And I think most people who have entered the job market after school can relate with that frustration, where it seems like all hiring companies want some kind of experience. And that does seem unfair. And I would argue a lot of the times it is unfair, but the reason those companies are doing that is because it's really hard to judge someone's merit for a position unless they've had previous experience that can speak directly to why they'd be a good fit for this new position.
Necessary. This just doesn't happen. People hire from outside the company, or they promote people they know the best, or people who will stir the boat the least,
Okay, so take two. So what Vaush brings up there is a great point. One of the greatest predictors of your future potential income is your connections, knowing people. And the reason that is, or a big proponent of why that is because it's really hard to evaluate someone's merits, where someone could be a great match on paper, but then they turn out to be a horrible match once they get there, because they have poor personal skills or just a whole slew of issues. And so it's a really good way, it's a really positive sign for your potential merit from the company's perspective, is that if someone within the company is willing to stake their reputation on your merits, that's a really good sign. Because a lot of people don't want, even if you're friends with them, they don't want to hire you if you're going to be an absolute disaster in that position, because that would speak really poorly on them. So having someone within the group, in the company, to vouch for your merits is highly, highly advantageous. and I would argue that's still technically a meritocracy. You're just competing in a dimension of merit that no one else really has because you have someone within the company who's willing to vouch for your merits. Where obviously not everyone applying for that position will likely have someone in the company vouching for their merit.
As far as I'm concerned, a meritocracy is when everyone is given the greatest possible ability to shine.
And I don't mean that to sound idealistic, because that kind of could sound idealistic. Obviously, some people could get a job when they're wholly undeserving with someone vouching for them. You know, and a classic example of that is like nepotism, where your dad owns a company and he's hiring his messed up kid, even though they definitely do not deserve it on paper or in practice. And that would not be meritocracy.
And in a world where if you take a look across California, you'll find millions and millions of people making the exact minimum wage and no more. My belief that every single one of them deserves that amount and none of them deserves something greater is just, it's unsustainable. I cannot believe such a thing. So yeah, if we want to improve our meritocracy, we have to acknowledge its faults. On a systemic level, socially, making sure people have access to the resources they need in order to be able to, express themselves and actualize their abilities. And within any other institution, which is one of the reasons why I'm a favor of worker co-ops, because I think democracies are a relatively effective venue for allowing people to shine in that sense.
I don't want, to lose Einstein.
So that was an interesting point by Vaush. Because what he's saying there is that democracies do, and we might not think about it this way, but when we vote in an election, it's ostensibly a meritocracy. In practice, it probably isn't, because I think some people were going to vote for a Republican, some people were going to vote Democrat no matter what. They're just saying, this is my team, I'm going to support them. But what we're really trying to get at is, who's the best person for this job? Vote for the person who you think is the best person for this job based on their merits. And a lot of those times, those merits aren't really a good fit for that position because the politician's position can be a lot more complicated than a lot of people understand. And that's kind of an issue with democracy, is that we could be voting in people who are maybe good at campaigning, and we're judging their merits basically just, they're a good campaigner, but then they get into the position and they're a disaster. Like, I would argue, like Trump. He was a great campaigner, but I wouldn't say he was a good president.
To bad economic conditions. But I would say that is a legitimate point where we can be the world could be better at selecting people who are highly skilled and promoting them. And I would say that the fact that companies are self-interested and they want to generate profit, and their ability to generate profit allows them to push out other companies that have other goals. And if a company has the goal of hiring people only who are 6 foot plus, they're going to have a hard time in whatever industry they are in compared to a company that doesn't necessarily have that. And so the degree to which you have these biases.
What if they just select?
And so what Tatash is saying, this is a pretty classic free market solution to discrimination. Like Ben Shapiro, he even makes this argument at times, is that essentially a company, imagine there's a company that's racist and they're only willing to hire a specific race. That discrimination in hiring is inherently going to make them less competitive because they're narrowing the people which they're willing to select from instead of opening up more based entirely on merit. They're looking for certain race and merit, where they should just be looking for merit. And I'm pretty sure in practice that doesn't really work out as ideally as we would hope. I think I should do a video on that. That'd be interesting.
Actively promote tall people.
Yeah, again, it's if you are having a company that has this goal that is external to profit, that is going to impede on the company's ability to compete with any company that doesn't have that external
But those
goal.
companies are on the S&P 500. Those studies that I referred to about in-corporate bias weren't being done at mom and pop shops. These are being done at the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. not all of them, but a lot of them. Clearly, these biases, you can go back to the 1950s when it was legal to not hire black people, or, like just say not to. Plenty of very powerful corporations just didn't. Clearly, it didn't affect them that much. Clearly the more rational corporation didn't jump in and compete.
So I actually just thought about this. Damn, I don't know if I want to talk about it because I'm kind of shooting from the hip here. But one point against Vaush on this point is there was, because it wasn't just black people, it was also Jews. And Jews nowadays, I mean, it's a stereotype that they're like really good lawyers, but even back then, they had a hard time getting into law firms that were, run by waspy people. They had the partners were WASP or whatever, white, Anglo, Protestant, Saxon, whatever. And that created a big, big advantage for a lot of probably Jewish men who became lawyers and started their own law firms, because there was also at the time, there was this kind of idea that mergers and acquisitions were kind of like dirty or not a good way to, it was unbecoming of a lawyer to do that kind of work, where if you were a lawyer, you wanted to be a trial lawyer. And so a lot of these Jewish lawyers were able to just absolutely crush it because they were willing to do these highly profitable, highly somewhat standardized acquisitions and mergers that a lot of other law firms weren't willing to touch. And nowadays, mergers and acquisitions is a huge part of the law industry because there's a lot of money to be made there, and it's incredibly complicated and incredibly work intensive because these companies are making billion-dollar, multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions. So there's a big slice, or there's a big magnitude. Like when you have a deal that big, even if those lawyers are only getting a small slice, in comparison to the whole pie, it's a ton of money for those lawyers to be getting.
Keep them out of business with their less discriminatory hiring practices.
I disagree. Absolutely. I disagree so much. I mean, like if you look at like companies today in reducing as much as possible this bias,
like businesses have been incentivized to make the most money for as long as they've existed. Kingdoms were incentivized to prolong the rule of their kings for as long as they could. Magnates, trade companies, all of these incentives. And yet what happens? War and death and plague and fire and discrimination. The idea that what incentive was there for the Holocaust?
Less discrimination over time, because
that I agree with, but we still have it, enough of it that I can't consider this a meritocracy.
Okay, yeah, maybe like you don't draw like the meritocracy line now, but I think that like we have to like fundamentally agree that like there's a push towards working this bias out because the bias is inefficient.
There is a push towards resolving some types of biases, like appearance biases, demographic biases in hiring in corporations. There isn't a push to fix the bias within accessibility to income and education and what have you on the ground level. We have
so now Vaush is doing what Hasan was doing, where now he's not really talking about meritocracy anymore. He's talking about the economic system that would empower people to engage or better engage in said meritocracy.
Record levels of income inequality, and there isn't a push to fundamentally restructure the unfairness of our existing economic system. I just want to ask something, because I do have to end soon. I didn't expect us to go for so long.
Yeah, sorry.
No, not at all. If you had a mega factory, just some huge factory, I don't know, a sweatshop, with 10,000 workers, and the only three things you could be in that factory are workers, managers, and then the owner. And there are 3 managers and an owner. So there are 4 people in executive positions and 9,900, whatever. Basically, everyone is a worker and there are very few people on top. If such a factory existed, and through omniscience, through genius and omniscience and pure profit-driven motive, the best people from the worker pool were pulled into the management and the owner positions. So the 4 out of the 10,000, the best of them always were put to the positions appropriate for their skills. Would you consider such a system to be a meritocracy?
I would consider that company's policy to be meritocratic. And I think that maybe the point that you're making is that even if companies have within themselves a meritocratic policy, the broader society, which allows people to enter into that company in the first place, might itself not have a high degree of meritocracy.
Absolutely, yes. And there would be such variance amidst the workers that any perception of meritocracy would be irrelevant. You would have tremendous variance in skills and abilities of all the workers on the ground level, and no way of differentiating them or putting them in places that they would be more comfortable, because the structure itself is broken. I feel the same way about corporations. They have a pyramid structure, top down, small at the top and large at the bottom. And without a democracy, that is such a system. One in which, no matter, even if somehow you could guarantee the best people are in management positions, that doesn't change the fact that there is a tremendous pool of very different people with no will to express at the bottom being treated the same. And I don't consider that meritocratic either.
So I don't really understand. I don't think that has anything to do with meritocracy. Again, a meritocracy is a system in which you select and promote based on merit.
Yeah, okay. So I think maybe we can end on like a point of common ground. I would say the extent to which, a broader society doesn't allow potentially skilled people to enter into businesses in which they are rewarded for their skills, that is to the extent that a society is not meritocratic. And I think that I'm also very critical of the existence of meritocracy in the United States, but I would also acknowledge personally that the United States, historically speaking, is much more meritocratic than many other societies.
Well, sure, I don't disagree with that. You set the bar kind of low, though. I still wouldn't consider it a meritocracy. And we certainly have the bars in different places.
And so I'd be curious to see what Vaush thinks. Maybe he thinks there's never been a meritocracy ever in the world. So this is a little off topic, but meritocracies can even run afoul. For example, there's something called the Peter Principle, and this is the idea. For example, The Office, the TV show, illustrates this a little bit. In which Michael Scott, he was a great salesman, and then he becomes a manager, and he's kind of a disaster as a manager. And the idea is that the people who are promoted to higher up positions are the best performers in their current position. But the performance in that lower position doesn't really predict better performance or good performance at a higher position. So going from a salesman to a manager, it doesn't, just because you're a good salesman doesn't mean you're going to be a good manager. And I think the best example I saw of this previously is, and this usually works out, that technical roles don't usually promote very well into management, or they have a fairly high failure rate, because what they're really good at is the technical side of this job, of this company, of this industry. So moving them up into a functional or people-oriented role, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be good, because they're good at the technical stuff. And a good example of this is mechanics. So there could be someone who's really good at fixing up cars, working with cars, all that great stuff. That doesn't mean they're going to be good at running the business of a car shop, of an auto shop. Okay, so now let's kind of go in to where I think a lot of people like Vaush and Hasan see failures in our current system and equate that to failures in meritocracy. So I think I would be lying to say that our meritocratic system doesn't have any issues. But I don't think it's issues that are really failures of meritocracy in itself. And I'm not saying there aren't failures of meritocracy. For like a very famous example of a failure in meritocracy is all those famous people who were paying and bribing their way for their children to get into prestigious schools. What was that one woman's name who bribing into college? So in 2019, a scandal arose over a criminal conspiracy to influence undergraduate admissions decisions at several top American universities. The investigation into the conspiracy was codenamed Operation Varsity Blues. So this is a subversion of the meritocratic system, where these famous people, these influential people, were contacting people in admissions or contacting faculty at schools to figure out how can we best optimize our child to maximize their chances of getting admitted into the school. And, one way was that they would get a spot on the row team because they would bribe the rowing coach, even though they've never rowed in their life. So they would technically be on the rowing team and they would never participate in the rowing team. And they would get accepted based on their supposed rowing merits, even though they had never rowed before and they had no plan to row while at school. Okay. So the big issue, let me back up a little bit actually. So when we talk about meritocracy, I think a lot of people like to think you're born with your merits. And this could not be farther from the truth. Everyone is born with maybe different potentials for merit. Like there could be, a boy genius, some Einstein or whatever, who obviously you give them the resources in front of them and they're going to excel beyond they're going to excel beyond levels that anyone else ever could. But the thing is that Einstein wouldn't be Einstein unless he got those resources in front of him. And so this is really what people see as the failures of meritocracy is really more of a failure of the economic system. Because who do you think is best to supply their children with the most resources? And it's going to be rich people because they have the access to the most resources. For example, Second Thought in his video shows how you can essentially see future incomes. You can see the future incomes of children based on where they're born, and that's because higher income areas are going to spend more on schooling, more on tutoring, more on extracurriculars. So they're going to be much more well developed, have a much wider array of merits that'll be that'll be advantageous to them to help them succeed and advance in the meritocratic tournament. I think that's the issue a lot of people miss out on. Because the meritocratic system, for the most part in America, is largely fair. When you go into an interview or you get into an admissions, unless there's the admission scandal like we looked at it previously, you're probably being judged fairly, assuming, sometimes what do you call that? Where based on your race, you're judged to different standards or whatever. But outside of that, for the most part, you're being judged fairly for your merits. It's just that for you to achieve merits, you have to be trained as a child. So the meritocratic tournament, success in the meritocracy, is really more about training, specifically parents training their children. And so richer people, have a much greater potential to train their children to be more successful in the meritocratic tournament. So the best predictors of the winners in a meritocracy are children who have parents who have a high income and have high educational attainment. And so if you're a child with a parent with high income and high educational attainment, you'll kind of get this feedback loop where you'll become a high income, high educational person who can then have children, and then the system just perpetuates itself. But we also have an issue where the best schools in America have been decreasing their admissions or been decreasing their acceptance rates because a lot of people want to go to these schools because these are the best schools in America. But instead of responding to that demand for people to go to their school, they're keeping their supply of open admissions the same. Because for them, this looks really, really good. But this is kind of poisonous. And I think in the long run, this is going to be very bad for them because they're missing out on a lot of talented people, a lot of talented kids, a lot of talented students who could have gone here and done really, really well. Because at the end of the day, judging merits is really, really hard. And we're always, just as people, we're going to always be at different levels on where we are in our life and, you know, our propensity to train harder or find our passions to really succeed at doing something great. And so we have a meritocratic system, but it acts as more of like an aristocratic meritocracy where rich people and highly educated people have the resources to train their children, but they also have the education from entering into the meritocratic system of education, and so they know how to succeed in that. And also when it comes to training your children, who's going to be better at training you in school or educating you in school? Is it going to be a parent who has no college degree or a parent who has a college degree? And it's probably going to be the parent who has the college. And so that's the issue with the meritocratic system. It has nothing to do with fairness. And I mean, and obviously there are some issues where it's not a full meritocracy. For example, schools, they will value legacy, which is garbage. And legacy is when if your mom or dad went there, you're more likely to be accepted because schools value that or whatever because they want, you know, university families where they have a whole lineage of kids who went there, which I think is understandable, but I don't think it's good. But it leads to a system in which if you fail in the meritocratic system, let me back up a little bit into the education. So one thing to get into those big schools like Yale, Harvard, and this kind of relates to what I was saying earlier, is if there's a recruiting manager or an admissions administrator, the best way, it's really hard to evaluate merits, so the best way for them to know if you're a good fit is if you have that more one-to-one experience. So for education, this looks like if you go to a prestigious preschool, you're more likely to go to a prestigious elementary school. And if you go to a prestigious elementary school, you're more likely to go to a prestigious high school. And if you go to a prestigious high school, you're more likely to go to a prestigious college. And the issue is that you can make a mistake as a child, which children obviously are going to, and then you fall out of that pipeline, of that prestigious education pipeline, and then it's very hard to enter. And if you didn't start at the beginning in that pipeline, it's hard to enter, especially if you were never in it. So then this issue happens where it feels like you can't even enter into this very profitable arena of meritocracy. It feels like you're locked out, especially if you have no college. And one of the authors who I read about this, Sandel, Tyranny of Merit, he believes that that Trump got so much he gained so much popularity because a lot of people in the middle of America, where they're not at the coast with all these like large big cities that have a ton of high-paying job opportunities, feel like they're being left behind. In a lot of ways, they are, because we're deindustrializing. A lot of manufacturing jobs have left, and that typically was the big driver of the middle class. And so those good jobs are leaving, and they're hesitant to move, which is natural because a lot of people want to stay where their family has stayed. And so they feel stuck and they feel angry. And that's why they believe that is causing this big divergence in college grads voting much more for Democrats, and less educated are voting for Trump. And so I would argue that the way this should be fixed is that we need to invest in education much, much more. And Daniel Markovits, his big argument the one thing he wanted to see to open up these Ivy Leagues, because these Ivy League schools ostensibly should be the best educating institutions in our country. They're said to be the best, so they should be the best. And so what he wanted to do is that a lot of these universities, they get these huge tax breaks. And schools like Harvard, they have maybe like a $2 billion endowment, which is, an endowment is money that people pay to the school because they went there or whatever, or, you know, they liked going there, so they're like, yeah, keep doing great stuff, here's the money. And they can hold that money and invest that money tax-free. And so Markowitz's idea is that we should take away that tax-free status unless they start accepting more people. So it would be fine if these schools wanted to keep this acceptance rate, but they would have to keep that acceptance rate by increasing their admissions. Yeah, by just increasing their admissions and just having more people apply. But by just keeping their student body the same size is unacceptable, because these best schools are becoming too selective, and it's not a good system. So we live in a meritocracy, I believe, in America. The system is majorly a meritocracy. But we have an issue in which the richer people, based on the economic system, where we're a bit more capitalist here in America than we are in, say, Europe, where we don't have that same level of social mobility that they have in Europe, especially France. France has a pretty high social mobility. And so they get outcompeted. They get blown out of these poor families get absolutely blown out of the water in terms of training their children compared to much richer, more educated families. That's really hard to address. But I think the way we address that is we take away the advantages, these brand, because really, like, the advantages these schools have is, for the most part, is they started earlier, so they have just a strong history, and they have a big endowment because they've been around for a while. They have a huge alumni network who's willing to pay back money to the university for that university to use for whatever they see fit, to make innovations, to make improvements, whatever. What do I want to say here? Kind of lost my train of thought. So what needs to be done is we need to invest more in school to make it more competitive, so everyone feels like they have more options. They have more options open to them, and they don't feel stuck where they feel like when they get older, like if you didn't go to college, you didn't finish high school, and you're 40-something years old, it's going to be really, really hard for you to move up, because then if you were to get your college degree then, it's just not going to be a good idea, because a lot of people won't want to take you because you'll be entry level, but you'll be really old, where they're kind of hoping to take in younger people, kind of groom them to be, you know, lifelong workers at this company. Yeah, it's not good. Not good. But we are a meritocracy. It's just a very insulated meritocracy.